With the basics behind us, it's time to get our hands dirty and get into the game. We're going to be talking about all of the game settings that you will be selecting from and enabling before you actually dive into a particular run of the last spell. That's going to include the Omen system, the Apocalypse system, the meta progression system, and an overview of each of the maps to get you oriented. So let's dive right in. When you first land on the last spells menu, you're going to be presented with the ability to enter into the tutorial. If you'd like to go back and see me work my way through the tutorial, that's episode 84 of the last spell. But we're going to assume that you've done the tutorial. If you haven't, go do the tutorial. It's no stakes. It's a scripted event. It's useful because it gives you a lot of context on how the game works. But after you finish the tutorial, you're going to be presented with this world map with the evil purple fog surrounding the specific townships. The original tutorial map is this one down in the lower left-hand corner here. This is Swampert, and then there are 4 additional maps currently. In the future, we have it on good authority that there will be a 5th map, likely called Glenwald, but we won't be covering that here as it is not yet released and will likely come out with the 1.0. The maps in their current form are Gildenberg, Lakeberg, Glenwald, and Elderlicht in order of difficulty. We'll get to the maps in a minute, but we're going to start out with the first system that you are confronted with when you select a map. And that is this menu here, which has your Omen system up at the top. So we'll dive right into that first. The easiest way to understand omens is that they are game modifiers, and each map gives you a budget of how many game modifiers you can equip. Essentially, most of these game modifiers, in fact, I would say all of these game modifiers are designed to make you more powerful in specific arenas. As an example, you could take, let's pick a good one here. You could take Omen of the Fortress. Omen of the Fortress makes all of your walls and barricades have 30% more health, and all of your other defenses have 50% more health. But like I said, this is a budget. And you spend that budget in varying ways. You can spend it on small improvements or you can spend it on large improvements. Small improvements cost a single Omen point. You can see 1 of 3 is used up, but this Omen is not particularly impactful. It is Omen of many swords, which means that swords appear more often. Might be interesting for a particular niche build, but it's not going to move the needle too terribly much. You compare that to, say, Omen of Vigor, which gives each of your heroes an additional action point, and you can see why the budgets are different. Now, even within each band of 1, 2, or 3 cost omens, as there are no omens that cost more than 3, you will see that there are a variety of power levels. As an example, Omen of Vigor, which gives 1 extra action point, is arguably stronger than Omen of Growth, which gives your heroes 3% more experience. Or my favorite example, Omen of Violence, giving 8% crit, is probably a lot stronger than Omen of Many Daggers, which just makes daggers show up more often. So at the beginning of your run, you're going to be asking the question, what do I want to focus on and how do I want to approach the run? At a very high level, I like to think of these omens as having kind of 4 categories, and we'll see if 4 was the right number. There's kind of RNG manipulation stuff like many swords, many scepters type of thing. Then there are hero-specific improvements. So I think of that as stuff like more crit for your heroes, more XP for your heroes, better level ups for your heroes. Then there are economy improvements. So these are things like making your scavenging better or making your scavenging automatic, increasing the quality of items that you are presented with, allowing you to build more houses. And then 4th and lastly are what I kind of consider to be the perk omens. So that's things like Omen of Juggler that gives all of your heroes a particular perk. We'll talk about perks later on. There's also a few miscellaneous omens like Omen of Second Chances that gives each of your heroes death denial. Actually surprisingly impactful, especially for new players. I would highly recommend Omen of Second Chances. Now, we talked about the budget, and we'll go through each map to see how the budgets differ, but there is also the opportunity to ignore the budget using Boundless Mode. So Boundless Mode allows you to greatly exceed the allotment for a particular map. It also adds 4 omens that are unique to Boundless Mode, one that makes the waves smaller, one that gives you more money, one that gives you an additional hero, and one that gives you a discount on everything that you buy. Now, I should note about the one additional hero. This kind of overlaps with down here. There is Omen of the Wanderer, which also allows you to have one hero. The difference being Omen of Reinforcements also increases the hero cap, which means you can go up to having 7 heroes. But anyways, the idea here is that you can build a run and not be limited by the Omen system. So for instance, if I wanted to do a trap and defenses run, I'd be able to pick up Omen of the Trapper, Omen of Siege, Omen of Trap Efficiency, Omen of the Fortress, Fortifications, Outpost, Omen of the Engineer, so on and so forth, and build a very focused run on defenses. The options are kind of limitless, but at a high level, hence the Boundless Mode, the Omen system is going to give you a lot of replayability because it's going to give you the ability to tailor specific runs to specific strategies that you're trying to accomplish. As I mentioned before, each map has its own allotment. So for instance, Gildenberg gives you 3 slots for omens. Lakeberg gives you 5. That means that you could pick, say, a 3-cost omen and then 2 1-cost omens, if that was what you were looking for. So you have the ability to kind of mix and match. Once you get into Glenwald, you start to have a lot of flexibility. 7 points means that you could do, for instance, 2 very impactful 3s, like maybe grab Omen of Vigor and Omen of Talent for an extra perk point. And then we also pick up our all-time favorite omen, Omen of Dexterity, which gives you a little bit of accuracy. We'll talk more about Omen of Dexterity in the future, but generally speaking, Dexterity is one of those accuracy is one of those must-have attributes. So picking Omen of Dexterity, especially at 1 omen cost, is hugely beneficial in the early game and frees up those early levels for other specialization. And then when you get to Elderlicht, you're going to be looking at a 9 omen budget, which means that you can do a lot of different things. You can do a lot of builds, and you need to because Elderlicht is substantially more difficult than any of the previous maps that you encountered. Now, after you've selected your omens, the next big decision, which has been lurking on the left-hand side for a while here, is your Apocalypse level. Now, Apocalypse level serves 2 purposes. It serves a primary purpose of giving you an engine to get more Tainted Essence. As you move through the Apocalypse levels, you'll see down here that the amount of Tainted Essence is increased by a scaling factor as you go through the Apocalypse levels. But second, and I think much more importantly, is it radically increases the difficulty of the game. Now, when I say that, I really do mean it. The difference between normal difficulty and Apocalypse 6 is a very satisfying chasm to have to cross. You're not simply going to breeze through the Apocalypse difficulties, especially on the later maps. Like, for instance, there's between Elderlicht Normal and Elderlicht Apocalypse 5 or 6 is significant. But let's go through each of the Apocalypse levels really quickly. You will unlock them as you beat the previous one. So when you first get in, you will only have normal, but then as you beat each Apocalypse level on any map, you will unlock that Apocalypse level for all maps. So base difficulty, that's the one that we start out playing on. The first increase is that enemies have 20% more health. This is not a change to be slept on. And the reason that I say that is we'll talk more about this when we talk about heroes and talk about enemies, but games of this nature have a core principle called breakpoints. And breakpoints means that All that really matters is if you kill the enemy or not. An enemy that you hit for 95% of its hit points is still alive and still takes a second action to finish off. So because you start out with unimproved or unupgraded items and weapons, the difference of 20% health is often the difference between getting a kill and not getting a kill. I should also say the Omens stack on top, the Apocalypse levels stack on top of one another. So when you enable Apocalypse level 1, you're getting 20% more health. When you add Apocalypse level 2, the 20% health remains active, and now your enemy wave sizes are 30% bigger. You don't get any extra XP for that, which is always stings a little bit, but 30% bigger waves is a big change up as well. I consider Apocalypse 2 to be a good place to kind of move to and sit at for a little while for new players, because the 40% additional Tainted Essence, which we'll talk about in a moment, is really nice. And these two modifiers are a big deal without being kind of transformative to the difficulty level. And I can't say the same thing about Apocalypse 3. Apocalypse 3 is the next big step up, or the first big step up in difficulty. It adds these things called mist sensors. We'll talk more about mist sensors in future videos, but they're basically objects with hit points that emanate mist that break your line of sight or your ability to target enemies around them, and they are scattered around the map. Basically, the way to think about them is they are very inconvenient, and they are a sink for your early action points, right? You have to spend actions to destroy them so that you can target the enemies underneath them. This is a big hit to your tempo in early turns when you are culling them. And so as a result, I consider Apocalypse 3 to be the first kind of like big leap in difficulty. It is a lot harder when you have to deal with the mist sensors. After you get mist sensors on lock, and we'll talk about how to do that in the future, Apocalypse 4 makes everything 20% more expensive without changing how much things get sold for. So it's a big hit to your economy, and you're getting 80% more Tainted Essence for it. This is another one of, I think this difficulty jump is about the same as 1 and 2. It's not nearly as big as the mist sensor increase in difficulty. And then Apocalypse 5 is the other major transformative increase in difficulty, where enemies get more movement points. Enemies getting more movement points throws massive wrenches into every aspect of the game, because it basically reduces your time required to kill enemies before they start threatening you substantially. Because when you think about it, it basically generally takes like 2 to 3 turns for an enemy to get inside your base. And with the increase in movement points, that might become too much more consistently, which means you have to be putting out a lot more damage. So Apocalypse 5 and Apocalypse 3 are on par for me as the two big ones. The total culmination of all of these difficulty modifiers leading up to 5 makes 5 feel really punishing. And then we need to talk about Apocalypse 6, which is the ultimate high-level apocalypse thing, but the modifier on it is not something that I feel particularly compelling. It basically adds a negative modifier to each piece of gear, which is very tedious, but generally not game-changing, right? It means you have to look at each piece of gear and be like, okay, can I lose the attribute? Did I get lucky? You know, oftentimes it means that a particular attribute of an item is just canceled out, like it has +1 skill range, -1 skill range. But it's back to an increase in difficulty like Apocalypse 4, 2, and 1. So those are your Omens and Apocalypse. Those are the two primary things that you'll be selecting before you start each run. You'll select the Omens that you want to inform the increases in power that you're going to be receiving, and then the increase in Apocalypse level, which is also going to be coming with an increase in Tainted Essence, which is one of the resources that you'll be spending in the meta progression system, which incidentally is the next thing that we want to talk about. The meta progression system is accessed via this icon in the lower right-hand corner, which always has the half purple, half yellow type of thing going on. This is also accessible in-game, unlike the Apocalypse and Omen systems, which are locked once you enter into a particular game. So as I mentioned in the first video, and now we'll mention again, there are two sides to the meta progression system. The light side over here and the dark side over here. We'll start out with the light side because I think it is the less interesting one and we won't spend a lot of time on it. The light side has this lovely angel who is basically keeping track of our progress in using the items in the game. And one thing you'll notice right off the bat is that I haven't even finished unlocking everything on this side. I've played a staggering amount of time, but there's a fair number of things that are not unlockable unless you kind of like focus on them or because I over focus on things. I'll explain that in a second. But at a very high level, we have a bunch of upgrades in here, and all of the upgrades are achievement based. So you get these unlocks by doing things in game. And as a result, I would not focus overly heavily on them. You should come back and check on them once in a while. You know, I might look at this and be like, okay, I should just have a hero that has a one-handed axe so I can polish off the last 212 action points spent with axes to improve my axes overall. But at a high level, these are divided into a bunch of different options here. So there are haven-based upgrades. Haven-based upgrades, among other things, unlock the maps. They unlock additional mages. They give you a few omens that change the way that the haven operates. You also have building upgrades. These are used to actually lock some of the access to build options. So for instance, you can't build the seer until you have done certain things and accomplished certain things. I think it's make it to a certain night of a certain map. I think seer might have been night 2 of Lakeberg or something like that. I don't actually remember. But same for housing, etc. So this will slowly unlock elements of the game that in turn makes you start with a lower level of complexity in the game and then slowly build up that complexity, right? You don't have the inn and the seer initially, and then you have them later. Heroes as well are going to be upgrades to the hero, like better hero traits overall, more action points for all your heroes, starting with a helmet, a trinket, a consumable, so on and so forth. And as you get these, you will see your heroes increase in power. Weapons are the ones that I am least likely to do because, as an example, I don't use great axes very frequently. So some of these are kind of limited. I have a pretty specific set of weapons that I kind of stick to, which means a lot of these don't get used. But you're also going to see some things like unlocking the ability to get epic items, increasing the variation of starting weapons, so on and so forth. Then we have equipment. We've already talked about some of this, but you know, much like the starting weapons, you have a whole bunch of equipment that you will unlock by doing things like stunning a certain number of enemies. And then last but certainly not least, we have our Omen unlocks, which a lot of the Omens come from this side, a lot of the Omens also come from the other side. But short version on Freud here is that she is giving you a set of challenges, like spend 1,000 action points casting skills with a sword, that will in turn unlock improvements, like getting rid of the worst sword in the game and replacing it with some other swords. But that being said, we have a whole second meta progression system, and this is the one that I think is more interesting because it comes with choices, and that is Schaden. And Schaden has a resource that they are looking to collect called Tainted Essence. It's indicated by this indicator in the lower left-hand corner. And you gain this through playing. We'll talk a bit more as we do the map orientation, but basically you're going to be getting Tainted Essence for killing bad guys, for winning or losing games, and then you're going to have the option to spend it over here on an incredible variety of things. Much like on the previous screen, you're going to have your Haven upgrades. You're going to have building skills and abilities that you're going to be able to unlock, improvements to your heroes that you're going to be able to unlock, weapons, equipment, and omens. Much like on the light side, there are certain unlocks that I consider to be very core to the game that you need to pick up early, like your gold mine, your scavenger camp, your armor maker, your weapon production buildings, jeweler, and alchemist. These are all core parts of the game that you're going to want to grab early. Like simply the ability to build stone walls is unlocked in this particular space. As we go through the maps, we'll talk a bit more about some of the specifics of what you want to pick up, but I think probably the most noteworthy thing here from my perspective is there's a ton of omens to unlock. Some of them are very good, but I would not recommend focusing on omens early game. The upgrades to your heroes on both sides, but mostly on this side, are relatively impactful. Especially getting more regen can be really good. Getting more damage for your heroes is a flat increase. Getting more experience for your heroes, better level ups. These are all things that are going to increase your power level quite substantially. And then the other thing, and I don't know if it shows up here or not. Yeah, actually it does. But it's very, very important, is the increase in uncommon and rare items. Do not underestimate how valuable it is to have more rare and epic items showing up. So once you get through the basics of unlocking all of the weapon types, unlocking all of the buildings that you need to build, unlocking the defenses that you need to build, things like ballista and mounted ballista are here, then you really want to start sinking as much as you can into the uncommon, rare, and epic item unlocks, because that's going to increase your power level curve as you curve into the higher difficulties, like Elderlicht as an example. But at a very high level, you're going to be bouncing back and forth pretty regularly between the light side and the dark side. On the light side, you're going to be seeing your progress towards certain achievements. And then on the dark side, you're going to be focused on buying particular omens or power increases that are in turn going to make it more likely for you to be able to progress further. Now, we're going to go through each of the maps at a high level. And we're going to swap mostly out of the user interface of the game in order to be able to talk through them. One of the things that I am going to be focusing on when we're talking through this is not only the map and how to think about the map, but also where I was in my progression when I beat this map. So for context, I think I've said this a couple times before, but I want to set the expectation that you can beat each of these maps on your first go at them. I did, and the important thing is to spend your Tainted Essence wisely and master the systems of the game, and then the rest will kind of fall into place pretty easily. So the first map that we're going to talk about is Swampert. I'm not going to dwell on Swampert too much because it is a scripted map, not an unscripted map. You cannot fail at Swampert. You have a town that is located on a bridge that only has access for monsters from two directions. So basically the upper left corner and lower right corner of the map. It's only 2 nights long. You die during the second night. Spoiler alert, apologies. And it's really just designed to give you a very basic introduction to the game. And I would encourage you just to play it. If you're watching this video and you already own the last spell, just play Swampert and don't worry too much about strategy until you've cut your teeth on it a little bit. Gildenberg is the first real map. And what I mean by that is it's the first map that you can fail at. We'll go over its overarching stats, and then we'll talk a little bit about your first encounter with it. So it is a map where you're attacked from 3 sides, and the map plays out over the course of 7 nights. The reason that you're only attacked from 3 sides is that your village/township is backed up to a mountain wall, which prevents enemies from attacking you from the upper left corner, basically, which makes the map a little bit easier. And then 7 nights basically means that there are going to be 7 production phases or 6 production phases before you reach the final boss. The final boss is relatively forgiving, but the important note about 7 nights is that strategies that blossom over the course of long periods of time are not going to play out well on Gildenberg. This means that things like A heavy item production build is not going to be a great match for Gildenberg, because by the time you scrap together enough money for those upgrades to make your production buildings generate better and better items, the map is going to be over before you even get to them. So you really need to think about that and focus on things that are more within your control, like getting the most impactful level ups and perhaps focusing on the shop where you can buy level appropriate gear. The other reason that the 7 Knights is particularly important is your characters also probably won't reach max level. That means you shouldn't be planning your builds around high level perks that you're probably never going to see. To be a bit more tactical about Gildenberg, the first time you encounter it, you will probably have around 7,700 essence. Essence being the thing that you spend on the purple side. I would broadly not recommend buying Omens with your early Tainted Essence, and instead go for permanent character upgrades. The things that I picked on my particular first run were unlocking weapons, pistol, scepter, one-handed axe, getting the production building, the armorer, the weaponsmiths, unlocking stone walls. That one was a little questionable, but I think it was relatively cheap. Unlocking ballista, and then unlocking potions. I don't remember exactly the potions that I got, but I think it might have been like movement and energy were available, something like that. Gildenberg should be relatively straightforward, but if we look at the map, the only other thing to highlight is that the terrain is very advantageous for the player, because it's all, you can really think of it as kind of like 3 funnels. The mountains in the lower right and bottom and left side all kind of funnel enemies into these natural choke points, which in turn makes them particularly susceptible to propagate attacks or area effect attacks. So Gildenberg, relatively straightforward. It's your first real opportunity to kind of cut your teeth on the game, but should be something that you dispatch relatively quickly once you get a hang of the game. We should also talk briefly about the starting setup. You're going to start with your shop and 2 houses, which is a relatively normal start, and you have a decent number of ruins for such a short map. Ruins are kind of like the source of early gold and materials that you trade your workers for that get you to the point where you can afford to build things like gold mines and, to a lesser extent on this map, production buildings. That moves us on to Lakeberg. And Lakeberg I consider to be kind of the gold standard map, in the sense that when I think about things that make the game easier or more difficult, I often compare them to Lakeberg as the baseline. As an example, I would say Gildenberg is easier than Lakeberg because it only has attacks from 3 sides, whereas Lakeberg has 4. So Lakeberg has 4 sides, although there are some structural impediments, like as an example, the upper right and upper left side of the map, the northeast and northwest sides of the map, if that's more intuitive for you, have a large chunk of them cut out by the lake. And that means that when enemies are entering on those sides, it is more predictable where they're going to come from, which makes it a little easier to know where the waves are going to come from. Lakeberg also is 12 nights long, which to me is like the perfect sweet spot. It's great for developing your heroes. It's great for developing your economy. And much like Gildenberg, you're going to be starting out with the same 2 houses, 1 shop, but you're going to have a lot more ruins, which also means that you're going to have a lot more of an accelerant for getting your economy spun up. When I entered, before I started Lakeberg, I had 14,000 Tainted Essence, and the Omens that I chose were Death's Denial, which I would highly recommend for new players. Death Denial basically means that the first time each one of your heroes was going to die, they go down to 1 hit point instead. This is great because it's very forgiving. When you make mistakes, you have the opportunity to kind of learn from them without losing a hero, which might lose you the run. And then I also had increased movement points, increased mana, health, and increased Tainted Essence gain. The primary things that I bought with my Tainted Essence were an additional item reroll, more uncommon items, and half of the upgrades for more experience gain. Lakeberg also has a boss. We'll talk about that more in the future bestiary video, but the Lakeberg boss is what I would consider to be the first really challenging boss. So I would highly recommend that you get to a point where you have at least one hero that you have built to be a heavy hitter. I would recommend someone who can hit pretty darn hard. Scepters are great for that, as a side note. And also, that hero should have Big Game Hunter, which makes their damage scale when they are hitting high HP enemies. But I've probably spoiled too much already, so let's move on to Glenwald. So Glenwald is a step up from Lakeberg in difficulty. You're going to be attacked from all four sides, and there are no major structural impediments, so you can really be attacked from all four sides. It mixes up the attack patterns. You're going to see broader waves in Glenwald than you saw in previous areas. And it's also 10 nights, which is shorter than Lakeberg. And again, makes it so that those heavy production builds are a little more challenging to execute. I wouldn't say that it is impossible to go for production builds, unlike what we saw with Gildenberg, where I think it is almost a complete waste of time. But there are certainly better strategies in my eyes for making Glenwald work well, rather than focusing heavily on your production buildings. You're also going to have a new enemy that shows up with Glenwald. Actually, I think 2 new enemies potentially. And the boss is much more difficult and requires a lot of flexibility and a lot of mobility. So think hard about those when you're going into this particular map. And other than that, you're in a very similar state to the state that you were in with Lakeberg. You're going to have 2 houses. You're going to have a fair number of ruins. Also, I think this is the best map, and this image that you're looking at right now is the best opportunity to really explore the idea of the confines of your base. You can go back to look at the other 2 if you are interested, but the other 2, Lakeberg and Gildenberg, are relatively square. Glenwald is actually not square. And what you'll notice is there is a difference between kind of like the green outskirts and the brown non-outskirts. And your base is the brown stuff. So all of the walls that you see are within the confines of your base, and they all line up against green borders. And we'll talk more about this when we get into the combat phase of things, but it's important to note that Glenwald, in particular, basically is non-square. The northern corner is missing. So you can think of it kind of like a diamond shape, like not diamond as in 4 corners, but diamond like the precious gemstone shaped with the top corner cut off. This can be particularly useful because it means that you have a little more time when enemies are attacking from the north. But it also means that you have this very awkward diagonal wall segment on that upper corner, and it's very difficult to put static defenses up there. To talk more specifically about my experience with Glenwald, I entered into Glenwald with about 20k worth of Tainted Essence. And I ran the same omens that I ran for Lakeberg. Tainted Essence, Health, Mana, Movement, and Death's Denial. I also added Omen of Leaps for that particular run, although I don't think it is super important. And then basically I spent all of my Tainted Essence on improvements to my weapons, unlocking certain weapons that were not yet unlocked, and increasing the likelihood of uncommon and rare items, which, as I talked about previously, is particularly useful. Now we move on to the final map, Elderlicht. Elderlicht is an absolute marathon. It is 14 nights, and when I say marathon, I really mean it, because in my experience, when I have run Elderlicht on stream, it's taken me 2+ streams to do. Each of my streams are generally 5 hours, which means we're talking 10+ hours, generally about 12 hours to do a run of Elderlicht. Because it is 14 nights long, and especially the later nights, you have an incredible amount of gear to sift through, level ups to do, etc. That being said, it is not slow and plodding. Elderlicht has a very aggressive tempo where it is just wailing on you the whole time. It is very close quarters. The fog starts particularly close, so you need to be very active at knocking down baddies very quickly. Has a unique mechanic. We won't spoil here, but that mechanic, again, requires a lot of mobility and a lot of flexibility. And then it has a unique start in the sense that when we look at it, we see that there is a scavenger camp, a shop, a seer, and 2 houses, but very, very few ruins, which is a serious complicating factor. We won't delve too much into Elderlicht. By the time you get there, you're going to be a lot more capable and a lot more powerful, and you're going to have played a lot more, and you're going to need it because there's a huge increase in difficulty there. When I went into my first run of Elderlicht, I was sitting on 28k worth of Tainted Essence. And for this one, I swapped up my omens and I had damage, engineering, movement, mana, Tainted Essence, and Death's Denial one more time. I unlocked a few different things, specifically Omen of Dexterity and Violence. I unlocked them and I should have used them, but I didn't. More uncommon and more rare items. Omen of Siege, Health and Mana Regen, and then Omen of Countless Paths, many of which I did not use. But with all that said, we have reached the end of this particular video. We gave you an overview of the Omen system. We gave you an overview of the Apocalypse system. We talked about meta progression, how to think about it, how to engage with the meta progression system. And then we gave you an orientation to each of the maps at a very high level. In future videos, we will talk about all sorts of things. The next video, we're going to focus on the preparation and production phases. So your town layout, your build orders, how you should be using the shop, how you should be using production buildings, etc. But that's it for this one, and I'll see you in the next one. If this was useful and you're interested in catching my future guides as they come out, please hit the subscribe button. And yeah, if you liked it, please hit that like button because it helps out a lot. But that's it for me. I'll see you in the next one.